The call from my mother came on a Tuesday afternoon while I was finalizing the details for another sales trip. At 48, I had spent over 20 years in medical equipment sales, and this upcoming Chicago presentation could be my biggest contract yet. I glanced at my phone, recognizing my mother's number. My first instinct was to let it go to voicemail, but something in my gut, that same instinct that had closed countless deals over the years, told me I should answer. "Maria, honey, how are you?" Diane's voice carried that familiar saccharine tone she always used when she wanted something. Even at 68, my mother hadn't changed her tactics. "I'm fine, Mom. Just getting ready for a trip to Chicago tomorrow." "The Harrison Medical Center account," I replied, tucking the phone between my ear and shoulder as I continued organizing my presentation materials. The hot flashes that had been plaguing me all week were starting again, and I took a deep breath to steady myself. "Well, I have some news." There was a pause on the line. "Your sister is back in town. She and Brian moved back from Arizona yesterday." I stopped what I was doing, my hand hovering over my suitcase. Jessica and I hadn't spoken much since Grandma Helen's will reading 4 years ago. The tension that had been building between us since childhood had finally crystallized into something more permanent that day. "Oh, I thought her husband's business was doing so well out there." She was always mentioning their success during the holidays. I couldn't keep the edge from my voice, remembering the Christmas cards with photos of their luxurious house and Jessica's designer outfits. Diane's voice dropped slightly. "Well, things didn't quite work out. Apparently, there were some issues with their business partners, and they decided it would be best to come home and start fresh." "I see." The familiar weight of anticipation settled in my chest. At 48, I had long ago learned to recognize when someone was about to impose on my carefully structured life. "I know exactly where this conversation is headed. The thing is, honey, they're staying with us right now. But you know how small our place is. Harold's knees are getting worse, and having them in the guest room means he has nowhere to do his physical therapy exercises." I closed my eyes and counted to 5, a technique my therapist had suggested years ago. The beginning of menopause had made my emotions harder to control lately, and I didn't want to snap at my mother. "Mom, are you asking what I think you're asking? Well, that house your grandmother left you is 3 bedrooms, and you're all alone in that big place. It would just be temporary until they find jobs and get back on their feet." Grandma Helen's house. My sanctuary. The one place that was truly mine after a childhood spent feeling like a guest in my own home. After Dad died when I was 5, Mom married Harold just 18 months later. Then came Jessica, and suddenly I was an afterthought in what was supposed to be my family. "How temporary is temporary?" I asked, my voice tight with restraint. "Oh, not long at all. A month or 2 tops. Brian already has some promising interviews lined up." I doubted that, but what choice did I have? At my age, I had learned that sometimes keeping the peace was easier than fighting battles I couldn't win. "Fine, they can stay in the blue bedroom, but only until they find their own place." After hanging up, I sat on the edge of my bed and let memories wash over me. Jessica was 6 years younger than me, Harold's biological daughter. From the moment she was born, she became the center of our family's universe. While Mom and Harold doted on her, I found refuge at Grandma Helen's house. Dad's mother never tried to replace my parents, but she gave me something they couldn't: undivided attention and unconditional love. Weekends at her house became my escape from Jessica's chaos at home. At 42, my sister still had the same habits she'd had as a child. She'd enter my room without knocking, borrow my things without asking, and throw tantrums when told no. Mom and Harold always defended her. "She's just expressing herself, Maria. Don't be so uptight." College had been my first real taste of freedom. Living in the dorms, I could finally have my own space that no one invaded. Then, during my senior year, Grandma Helen passed away. I was devastated, but amid my grief came an unexpected gift. She left me her house and savings. It wasn't a fortune, but it was enough to help me start my life debt-free. Jessica's reaction was swift and entitled. "This isn't fair. We should sell it and split the money." "She wasn't your grandmother," I'd replied, my patience worn thin after days of funeral arrangements. "She was my dad's mother, not related to you at all." but we're still family. Mom, tell her. And true to form, Diane and Harold had gently suggested I consider sharing with my sister. I refused, and our already strained relationship fractured further. We barely spoke after that, except for obligatory family gatherings. I attended her wedding when she was 26, watching her marry Brian, a man 10 years her senior with family money and business connections. They moved to Arizona shortly after, and I was secretly relieved to have her even further from my life. Now, 4 years later, they were back, and soon they'd be in my house. I finished packing for my Chicago trip with a sense of dread. My job as a sales representative for a medical supply company kept me traveling regularly, something I usually enjoyed. Now, those business trips would serve a different purpose: escapes from whatever chaos Jessica would inevitably bring into my home. A week later, they arrived with 4 suitcases of designer clothes and accessories. At 42, Jessica looked remarkably like our mother, the same honey blonde hair and bright smile that could charm anyone. She hugged me with artificial enthusiasm, her expensive perfume enveloping me like a cloud. "Maria, it's been ages," she squealed, as though we were best friends reunited after a brief separation rather than estranged sisters. Brian shook my hand firmly. At 45, he still maintained the confident demeanor of someone used to success, despite the business failure that had brought them back. His tailored suit and manicured nails told me their financial situation might not be as dire as my mother had implied. "Thanks for this, Maria. We really appreciate it," he said with practiced sincerity. I showed them to the blue bedroom and helped them unpack. As I hung up Jessica's third designer coat, I couldn't help thinking that selling just one of these items could probably cover a month's rent somewhere. My headache, a constant companion since entering perimenopause, intensified as I contemplated how long they might actually stay. At dinner that night, Brian cleared his throat. "I've got some promising leads already. I'm meeting with an old college friend tomorrow who works in investment banking." "That's great," I said, genuinely hoping he'd find something quickly. At my age, I valued my privacy more than ever, and having house guests, especially these particular ones, disrupted the peaceful routine I'd established over years of living alone. Jessica twirled her fork in her pasta. "I won't be looking for work right away. I'm more of a homemaker, you know. I love taking care of the house and making things nice." I raised my eyebrows, looking pointedly around at my immaculate kitchen that I'd maintained myself for 20 years while working full-time. "Well, that's perfect then. Since you enjoy household chores, you can handle the cleaning, cooking, and laundry while you're here." Her face fell instantly, as if I'd suggested she scrub toilets with a toothbrush. "Oh no, that's not what I meant. I like doing that in my own home. I'm a guest here." "So you're a homemaker, but only when it's convenient?" I couldn't help myself. Nearly 5 decades of life had taught me that some patterns never change. "Don't twist my words," she snapped. "I just meant I'm still settling in." Brian jumped in to change the subject, and I let it drop. But I already knew how this arrangement would play out. Some things never change, and my sister's aversion to responsibility was one of them. 2 weeks later, 2 weeks into living with Jessica and Brian, I'd established a routine: wake up early, leave for work before they got up, and return home as late as possible. It wasn't ideal, but it helped me minimize my time around Jessica, who had already fallen into her old habits. Despite her claims of being a homemaker, I'd come home each evening to find dishes in the sink, clothes strewn across the living room, and no sign of dinner. Meanwhile, Jessica would be sprawled on my grandmother's antique sofa, scrolling through her phone or watching reality TV. "Oh, you're back," she'd say without looking up. "Can you make something to eat? I'm starving." The first few times I'd bite my tongue and make dinner for all of us. By the second week, my patience was wearing thin. The hot flashes and mood swings of perimenopause didn't help matters. I found myself increasingly irritable with each passing day. "Jessica, what did you do today?" I asked one evening after finding the house in disarray again. My back ached from a long day of sales calls, and the sight of my once peaceful home in chaos pushed me to the edge of my tolerance. She shrugged. "Went to see Mom and Harold, then met up with Jessica from high school." "Did you know she has 2 kids now?" Her life is so boring. Did you have time to maybe run the vacuum or start a load of laundry? I gestured to the pile of her clothes that had somehow migrated to my living room floor. God, Maria, you're so uptight. I've been busy reconnecting with people. Besides, it's your house, shouldn't you want to keep it nice? She looked at me as if I were the unreasonable one, demanding slave labor rather than basic courtesy. I had to walk away before saying something I'd regret. Brian, at least, seemed to be making an effort. He left every morning in a suit, returning in the evenings with stories about interviews and networking events. Whether he was actually job hunting or just avoiding the house, I couldn't tell, but at least he wasn't adding to my stress. When my boss called with news of a week-long business trip to Boston, I nearly hugged him through the phone. Great news, Maria. That hospital chain is finally ready to hear our pitch. This could be the biggest deal of your career. 7 whole days away from this situation sounded like paradise. The night before my departure, I made my expectations clear to Jessica. I'll be gone for a week, I said as I packed my suitcase. I don't want any parties in my house while I'm away. No guests staying over, no messes that'll be waiting for me when I get back. Jessica dramatically rolled her eyes. Yes, Mom. Anything else? No breathing your precious air? No sitting on your sacred furniture? Brian's got a second interview next week, so hopefully we'll be out of your hair soon anyway, she added with a sweetness that didn't reach her eyes. I left early the next morning, trying to ignore the nagging feeling that something would go wrong in my absence. At 48, I'd learned to trust my instincts, and they were screaming that trouble was brewing. The Boston trip turned out to be a blessing. Not only did I get a break from the tension at home, but I closed a deal with a major hospital network that would earn me a substantial bonus. After 20 years in medical sales, this was the crown jewel of my career, a multi-million-dollar contract that would secure my position at the company for years to come. My boss was thrilled, promising a nice percentage on top of my regular commission. Exceptional work, Maria, he said during our final call. This is why you're our top rep. Take an extra day if you need it. You've earned it. I declined the extra day, booking the earliest flight home instead. Despite my concerns, part of me hoped that Jessica and Brian had respected my wishes. Maybe I'd return to find the house in order and good news about Brian's job prospects. My flight landed late Sunday afternoon. The New England autumn had followed me home, painting the suburban streets with golden light as my taxi pulled up to the house. From the outside, everything looked normal, which I took as a good sign. But as I unlocked the front door, wheeling my suitcase into the foyer, I noticed something odd. There were 3 unfamiliar suitcases stacked by the stairs. Before I could process what this meant, I heard laughter coming from the living room, not just Jessica and Brian's voices, but others I vaguely recognized. My headache, dormant during my successful business trip, returned with a vengeance. I dropped my bags and marched toward the sound. The scene that greeted me stopped me in my tracks. Jessica and Brian sat on my grandmother's sofa, coffee cups in hand, across from an older couple I recognized as Brian's parents, Richard and Betty. All 4 looked up in surprise as I appeared in the doorway. Maria. Jessica's voice hit an unnaturally high note. We weren't expecting you until later tonight. Clearly, I replied coldly, looking pointedly at the extra luggage in my hallway. The hot flash that swept over me had nothing to do with menopause and everything to do with anger. What's going on here? Jessica plastered on a smile that hadn't changed since she was 16 and trying to talk her way out of trouble. Oh, you remember Brian's parents, Richard and Betty. They decided to come visit us for a little while. Isn't that nice? I opened my mouth to object, to remind everyone that this was my house and I hadn't authorized any guests, when Jessica jumped up, grabbed my arm, and practically dragged me into the kitchen. Just give us a minute, she called over her shoulder before closing the kitchen door behind us. Have you lost your mind? I hissed, pulling my arm free. I specifically said no guests. I know, she whispered, her eyes pleading. But I need you to play along just for a little while. 2 weeks tops. 2 weeks? Absolutely not. I want them gone tomorrow. The vein in my temple throbbed as I struggled to keep my voice down. Please, Maria. Her voice dropped even lower as she glanced nervously at the kitchen door. I told them this house belongs to me. Brian played along. They've been treating me so much better since they think I have this nice place. After the business failed, they've been so cold to me, blaming me for distracting Brian or whatever. This is helping us save face. My jaw literally dropped. At 48, I thought I'd seen every manipulation tactic my sister could muster, but this was a new low. You're out of your mind. I'm not playing along with this insanity. Please. She grabbed my hands, her manicured nails digging into my skin. I'll do all the housework, I swear. I'll cook, clean, do laundry, everything I haven't been doing. Just pretend you're staying with me for a while because you're having work troubles. Please, Maria. I've never asked you for anything. Her eyes filled with tears, a trick that had worked on our mother countless times but had long since lost its effect on me. I looked at her desperate face and felt myself wavering. It was ridiculous, completely insane, but somehow I found myself nodding. 20 years of keeping peace in the family had conditioned me well. 2 weeks, not a day longer, and you'd better keep your promise about the housework. Relief flooded her features. Thank you, thank you, thank you. I swear you won't regret it. We returned to the living room, where I was introduced as Jessica's sister who was temporarily staying with her due to some work issues. Betty nodded sympathetically, though her eyes held a hint of judgment that made my skin crawl. It's so good of Jessica to help out family in need, she said, patting her daughter-in-law's hand. We've always taught Brian that family comes first. Dinner that evening was takeout from the restaurant across the street, though Jessica claimed she'd made everything herself. I watched in disbelief as she transferred pad thai and spring rolls onto my grandmother's serving dishes in an elaborate charade. Richard and Betty dominated the conversation, explaining how their son's business had failed due to unscrupulous partners and cutthroat competitors, never once suggesting that Brian might bear any responsibility. Throughout their tale of woe, Jessica nodded attentively, occasionally squeezing Brian's hand in a show of solidarity. As the meal ended, Jessica turned to me with a sweet smile that immediately set off alarm bells. Maria, would you mind handling the dishes while I chat with Richard and Betty? Thanks, sis, she added with a wink that only I could see. And just like that, I knew I'd been played. As I scraped plates at the sink, watching Jessica laugh and charm her in-laws in my living room, I had the sinking feeling that her promises about housework would never materialize. At 48, I should have known better than to trust the word of someone who had been breaking promises to me since childhood. 1 week later, my prediction about Jessica's broken promises proved spot on. A week into this bizarre charade, and I'd become the unofficial maid, cook, and punching bag for the entire household. Every morning, I'd leave for work while everyone else slept in. Brian had completely abandoned his job search, instead playing tour guide to his parents around town. They'd spend their days shopping, sightseeing, and dining out, all while I worked to pay the house bills they believed belonged to my sister. When I'd return each evening, Jessica would make a show of cooking dinner for her in-laws, which meant ordering takeout, transferring it to my grandmother's cherished serving dishes, and then parading it out as her own creation. She'd even mess up the kitchen to make it look like she'd been cooking all day. Maria, could you help clean up the kitchen? Became her nightly refrain, always delivered with Betty watching. Since you're staying with us, it's only fair you contribute. I'd bite my tongue and do as asked, feeling Betty's judgmental stare boring into my back. She'd taken to making little comments within my earshot. It's so generous of Jessica to help her sister during hard times. Family should always come first. Or, I raised Brian to be successful, but also to help those less fortunate. I'm glad he's supporting both his wife and her struggling sister. Each night, I'd retreat to my bedroom, which Jessica had offhandedly referred to as the guest room when showing her in-laws around, and take 2 extra strength painkillers for my increasingly persistent headaches. The hot flashes that woke me several times each night didn't help matters. At 48, I was exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with physical age and everything to do with emotional drainage. One evening, after a particularly exhausting day at work where I'd had to defend my successful Boston contract against a competitive bid, I cornered Jessica in the laundry room. This has to stop, I said, my voice low but firm. You promised you'd do the housework, but I'm doing everything while you play hostess in my house. She had the decency to look guilty. though I couldn't tell if it was genuine or another performance. I know, I'm sorry. It's just that Betty has such high expectations, and I don't want to disappoint her. When are they leaving? It's been over a week. They need to go. I folded my arms across my chest, a gesture my colleagues recognized as my negotiation stance. I'll talk to Brian, she promised, but I could tell from her expression that nothing would change. At 42, Jessica was still the same as she'd been at 16, full of promises she had no intention of keeping. That night, I received the monthly utility bills and nearly collapsed. The cost had more than doubled with 5 people in the house. Extra water usage, electricity running all day, heating kept at tropical levels because Betty was sensitive to cold. It all added up to hundreds of dollars more than my usual bills. I stormed downstairs, bills in hand, finding Jessica alone in the kitchen, arranging store-bought cookies on a platter for afternoon tea. Look at this. I thrust the papers at her. The utilities have doubled. You need to pay at least half. Jessica scanned the bills, her eyes widening. I can't afford this. We don't have any money right now. That's not my problem. You're all living here, using water and electricity all day while I'm at work. I'm not covering this alone. The hot flash that swept over me made my face burn with heat that matched my rising anger. Don't be like that, Jessica whined, her voice taking on the childish tone she'd used throughout our youth. We're family. Can't you help us out just this once? My patience finally snapped. 2 decades of professional restraint couldn't contain the frustration that had been building since they arrived. No, I'm tired of this whole situation. If you can't contribute financially, then you need to at least do what you promised and take care of the house. But you haven't done that either. I'm sick of being taken advantage of. I hadn't realized how loud I'd gotten until I heard the front door open. Brian and his parents returned from their latest outing, catching the tail end of our argument. What's going on here? Richard demanded, his eyebrows furrowed in disapproval. Jessica's expression morphed instantly from petulant to victimized. Maria doesn't want to pay her share of the bills, she said, her voice small and hurt. I stared at her in disbelief. After everything, she was still throwing me under the bus. Betty stepped forward, her face stern. Young lady, I don't understand your attitude. Your sister has generously opened her home to you during your difficulties, and this is how you repay her? By refusing to contribute. That's not what I started, but Richard cut me off. Frankly, we've noticed your lack of gratitude since we arrived. Jessica cooks and maintains this beautiful home while you just come and go as you please, taking advantage of her goodness. My head was spinning. The sheer absurdity of being lectured about taking advantage of Jessica in my own house was too much. Without another word, I grabbed the bills and retreated to my bedroom, locking the door behind me. I could hear them downstairs, their muffled voices rising and falling through the floor. I imagined Jessica playing the victim, her in-laws comforting her, all at my expense. The injustice of it burned in my chest, a physical pain that no amount of deep breathing could alleviate. When hunger finally drove me downstairs for dinner, the atmosphere was frigid. Betty and Richard barely acknowledged my presence, while Jessica avoided meeting my eyes. Only Brian seemed uncomfortable with the tension, fidgeting with his napkin and attempting small talk that quickly died. Then Betty cleared her throat. Jessica, dear, my father always taught me that honesty and respect are the foundations of any household. Of course, Mom, Jessica replied with practiced daughterly respect. Which is why we feel we must speak up. Betty shot a pointed look in my direction. We don't think it's working out having your sister here. She's clearly taking advantage of your hospitality, and frankly, her attitude is affecting the peace of your lovely home. I nearly choked on my water, the irony almost too much to bear. Richard nodded in agreement. You've been more than generous, but there comes a point where you have to put your own family first. Brian agrees, don't you, son? Brian mumbled something unintelligible, studying his plate intently. Betty continued, her voice dripping with false compassion. We think it would be best if Maria found other living arrangements soon. All eyes turned to Jessica, waiting for her response. I watched her curiously, wondering if she'd finally come clean about whose house this actually was. She hesitated, her eyes darting between her in-laws and me. I could see the internal struggle playing out on her face, the moment of truth for a woman who would spend her life avoiding truth. Then, with a deep breath, she turned to me. "Maria," she said, her voice unnaturally firm, "I think it would be best if you packed your things. I need you to move out in 2 weeks." The breaking point. The silence that followed was deafening. Richard and Betty nodded approvingly, while Brian stared at his wife in shock. Jessica's eyes met mine, pleading silently for me to play along one more time, but something in me had finally snapped. I'd spent 48 years accommodating others, swallowing my needs and desires to keep the peace. But there comes a time in every woman's life when enough is simply enough. I slowly stood up, placed my napkin on the table, and looked around at the people who had invaded my life and my home. My sanctuary. The place where, for 20 years, I had built a life that was finally mine alone. "No," I said quietly, with a calm that surprised even me. "I don't think I will." The room fell silent after my refusal. Betty's mouth hung open in shock, while Richard's face reddened with indignation. "Excuse me," Betty finally sputtered. "This isn't your decision to make, young lady." I almost laughed at being called young lady at 48. Instead, I leaned forward, placing my palms flat on the dining table, my grandmother's table in my house. "Actually, it is. Everyone in this room has exactly 2 days to pack their things and leave. And I mean everyone." Jessica's face drained of color. "Maria, please, can we talk about this in private?" "No more private talks, Jessica. I'm done with the lies and manipulation. The decades of keeping quiet, of being the responsible one, the understanding one, ended in that moment. I'm almost 50 years old. The time I have left is too precious to waste on this charade." I turned to Betty and Richard. "There's something you should know. I've let Jessica and Brian stay here temporarily because they needed help. But this is my house. I own it. I pay the bills. I inherited it from my grandmother 20 years ago, and it's the only place I've ever truly felt at home." Betty's eyes narrowed suspiciously. "Jessica, is this true?" Jessica looked like she might throw up. "I can explain. You told us this was your house." Richard's voice had turned dangerously quiet. "You showed us around like you owned the place." Brian finally spoke up. "Dad, we were just trying to save face. After the business failed, we didn't want you to know how bad things had gotten." The next few minutes were chaos. Betty and Richard shouted at Brian and Jessica. Jessica cried and tried to defend herself. Brian sat with his head in his hands, looking defeated. I stood watching the fallout of my sister's lies crumbling around her, feeling strangely detached from the drama. "Quiet." I slammed my hand on the table hard enough to make the dishes rattle. "I don't care about your family drama. I want all of you out of my house in 2 days." Betty stood up with as much dignity as she could muster. "We'll be leaving immediately. We wouldn't stay another minute in a house built on lies." She glared at her son and daughter-in-law. "And you two don't expect to come running to us after this humiliation." Within an hour, Betty and Richard had packed their bags and called a taxi. They left without saying goodbye to anyone, the door slamming behind them with finality. The sound echoed through the house, my house, like a period at the end of a very long sentence. As soon as they were gone, Jessica exploded. "How could you do this to me? You ruined everything. They'll never forgive us now." "Me? You lied to them, Jessica. You lied to me. You've been taking advantage of me since the day you moved in." The headache that had been my constant companion throbbed behind my eyes, but for once, I welcomed the pain. It reminded me I was alive, that I had feelings that mattered. I was desperate. Their approval means everything to Brian's future. Now we have nothing. Tears streamed down her face, smearing her expensive mascara. "That's not my problem," I said calmly. My voice sounded different to my ears, stronger, more assured. "You have 2 days to find somewhere else to live." Jessica's face contorted with rage. "You've always been jealous of me, always. Just because Grandma Helen left you this house. She left me this house because she was my grandmother, not yours, and because I was the only one who spent time with her, who cared about her. You only showed interest in what you could get from her." The truth of my words gave them weight, made them impossible to dismiss. "That's not true." "It is true. Just like it's true that you haven't changed a bit since we were kids. You still think the world revolves around you, that rules don't apply to you, that everyone should bend over backward to accommodate you. Well, I'm done accommodating you, Jessica. I'm almost 50, and I have the right to live the rest of my life on my own terms. Get out of my house. I turned and walked upstairs, locking myself in my bedroom to the sound of Jessica's continued shouting. I was shaking with adrenaline, but also felt strangely calm. For the first time in my life, I'd stood up to my sister without backing down, without seeking compromise. The relief was so profound I could taste it. Early the next morning, my phone rang. It was my mother. Maria, what in the world is going on? Jessica called me last night, hysterical, saying you've thrown her and Brian out. They have nowhere to go. I closed my eyes, feeling the old pattern trying to reassert itself. The dutiful daughter, the responsible sister, the fixer of other people's problems. But not this time. They can stay with you and Harold. Your house isn't that small. That's not the point. Family helps family, you know that. I laughed bitterly. Does that rule apply to Jessica too? Because she hasn't done a thing to help me since she moved in. Instead, she lied to her in-laws, claiming my house was hers, and then tried to kick me out when they suggested it. I'm sure there's been a misunderstanding. No misunderstanding, Mom. For once, I made her listen to me instead of automatically taking Jessica's side. She and Brian moved in, promised it would be temporary, then invited his parents without asking me. She left all the housework to me while pretending to her in-laws that she was the lady of the house. When I asked them to contribute to the doubled utility bills, she refused and then blamed me in front of everyone. My mother was silent for a moment. Well, I'm sure she didn't mean. I don't care what she meant. I've been more than generous, and she's taken advantage at every turn. They need to leave today. Maria, please reconsider. No. And honestly, Mom, I don't want to hear from you or Harold either if you're just going to defend her like always. I'm tired of being the responsible one who never gets any consideration. I'm almost 50 years old, and it's time I started putting myself first. I hung up before she could respond. It felt surprisingly good to finally stand my ground. By that evening, Jessica and Brian had packed their belongings. They didn't say goodbye, and I didn't expect them to. Some relationships are beyond repair, and sometimes that's for the best. Epilogue. In the following weeks, I heard through mutual acquaintances that Jessica and her in-laws were no longer on speaking terms. Apparently, they'd told her she wasn't welcome in their home after the deception. My mother called several times, leaving voicemails that gradually evolved from demanding I apologize to awkwardly suggesting family dinner to clear the air. I deleted them all. Nearly 5 decades of experience had taught me that some patterns only change when you refuse to participate in them any longer. 3 months after the blow-up, my house was peaceful again. The utility bills returned to normal. My work trips became enjoyable rather than necessary escapes. I redecorated the blue bedroom, converting it into a home office where I could work remotely when not traveling. The bonus from my Boston deal allowed me to finally renovate the kitchen, something I'd been putting off for years. I sit now on my grandmother's porch swing, watching the sunset over the neighborhood she loved. At 48, I finally learned that setting boundaries isn't selfish, it's necessary. This house isn't just a building. It's my sanctuary, my inheritance, my home. And finally, blissfully, it's mine alone again. Tomorrow, I'll call my mother. Perhaps it's time to establish a new relationship with her, one built on mutual respect rather than obligation. But that's a challenge for another day. Tonight, I'll enjoy this moment of peace, this sense of finally being home not just in this house, but in my own life.
The annual Brown Interiors 50th anniversary celebration in Detroit was always a grand affair, but this year felt different. As I sat in the hotel's beautifully decorated conference room watching my 16-year-old daughter Amy check her phone, I caught sight of my ex-husband David rehearsing his acceptance speech for the company's Legacy Award. The irony of him receiving an award for upholding family values wasn't lost on me, especially considering what I had discovered in his messages 20 years ago. My name is Diane Foster, and at 52, I had rebuilt my life after a devastating betrayal, a successful career as an IT systems consultant, a beautiful daughter approaching college age, and hard-earned peace of mind. David was still the golden boy of Brown Interiors, following in his father's footsteps as vice president of operations. Everyone had praised us as the perfect couple back then, and I believed it too, until that morning when his phone buzzed during breakfast. "Mom, why are we even here?" Amy whispered, leaning close to me. Her dark eyes, so much like mine, held a mixture of boredom and curiosity. "I barely know these people." "We're here because your grandfather William specifically asked us to come," I replied, smoothing an invisible wrinkle from my navy dress, the one I'd chosen carefully to project confidence without seeming like I was trying too hard. "This celebration is important to him." What I didn't say was how my stomach had been in knots for weeks after receiving William's invitation. 20 years had passed since I'd attended a Brown family function. 20 years since I'd discovered David's affair with his assistant and his plans to steal company secrets. 20 years of deliberately building a life separate from the Browns, except for the necessary communications regarding Amy. Across the room, my former mother-in-law Elizabeth Brown was holding court, her perfectly coiffed silver hair and society smile exactly as I remembered. She caught my eye and gave a practiced wave before making her way toward us, her expensive perfume announcing her arrival seconds before she reached our table. "Diane, dear," Elizabeth called out, approaching with measured steps. "How wonderful that you could make it. And Amy, my goodness, you're growing into such a beautiful young woman." "Thank you, Mrs. Brown," Amy replied with the polite formality I'd taught her to use with her grandparents. She'd seen them perhaps twice a year at most, carefully orchestrated visits that I endured for her sake. "Is everything to your liking?" Elizabeth asked, her eyes assessing my appearance with the same critical gaze I remembered from decades ago. "William was so pleased when you accepted the invitation." "Everything is lovely," I said, maintaining the civil tone I'd perfected over years of co-parenting with David. "The hotel has done a beautiful job with the celebration." Elizabeth beamed with practiced charm. "We're blessed to have you join us for this milestone." "Amy, dear, has your mother told you about the family scholarship fund? For college? Your grandfather has some wonderful ideas about your future." I felt Amy stiffen beside me. This was exactly what I'd feared, the Browns attempting to exert influence over Amy's future without consulting me. Before I could intervene, William Brown approached, his tall frame still commanding despite his 72 years. "Diane," he said with a nod that conveyed more respect than his son had ever shown me. "I appreciate you coming today. Could I have a word in private before the ceremony begins?" 20 years ago, it had been William who had recognized my IT expertise when his son only saw me as a pretty wife. It had been William who had offered me a way forward after discovering David's betrayal. And now, as I excused myself from the table to follow him to a quiet corner, I wondered what new complication the Brown family was about to introduce into my carefully constructed life. A private conversation, William led me to a small sitting area away from the main celebration, his movements deliberate as he eased himself into a leather armchair. The years had added more lines to his face, but his eyes remained sharp and assessing, the eyes of a businessman who had built Brown Interiors from nothing into one of Detroit's most respected furniture companies. "You look well, Diane," he said, studying me carefully. "Your consulting firm has quite the reputation in the industry now." I straightened my shoulders slightly, a habit formed over decades of proving myself in male-dominated boardrooms. "Thank you. We've been fortunate to work with some excellent clients." William nodded, getting straight to the point as he always had. "I'll be direct. Brown Interiors is facing challenges. The furniture industry has changed dramatically, and our online presence and technological infrastructure are insufficient." A familiar tension crept into my shoulders. "And you're telling me this because I'm hoping you might consider consulting for us." His weathered hands rested on his knees as he leaned forward. "Your expertise in retail technology systems is exactly what we need." The irony wasn't lost on me. 20 years ago, I had discovered David planning to steal company secrets to start his own venture with his assistant Jessica. Now his father was asking for my help to save the very company David had tried to undermine. I don't think that would be appropriate, William. David and I. This isn't about David, he interrupted, his voice carrying the authority of someone used to being obeyed. This is about Brown Interior's future, about the employees who depend on our success, and about Amy's inheritance one day. At the mention of my daughter, I felt a familiar protective instinct rise within me. Amy's future is secure. I've made sure of that without any help from the Browns. William's expression softened slightly. I know you have, Diane. You've done an admirable job raising her. But this company is part of her heritage too, whether you like it or not. Before I could respond, a young woman approached us, Jessica Morris, David's current assistant and, if the gossip I'd overheard was accurate, his latest romantic interest. At 35, she was nearly 20 years younger than David, with a perfectly tailored suit and ambition radiating from every pore. Excuse me, Mr. Brown, she said, pointedly ignoring my presence. David is ready to begin the presentation whenever you are. William dismissed her with a curt nod. As Jessica walked away, I caught her glancing back at us with poorly disguised curiosity. Some things never change, I murmured, watching her retreating figure. William's gaze followed mine, his expression unreadable. We should return to the celebration. But Diane, please consider my offer. The board meeting is tomorrow at 10 a.m. I'd like you to attend as my guest. As we walked back toward the main room, I spotted Amy deep in conversation with her Aunt Sarah, David's younger sister. Sarah had always been kind to me, one of the few Browns who had reached out occasionally over the years. Seeing them together, their heads bent in conversation, I was struck by how much Amy resembled her father in her mannerisms, despite having my coloring and intellect. David was now at the podium, adjusting the microphone, his silver-streaked hair and confident posture still charming the room. As our eyes met briefly across the crowd, I felt an echo of pain I thought I'd long since buried. Not because I still loved him, that had died the moment I'd seen his messages to Jessica 20 years ago, but because of what could have been, what should have been, for Amy's sake. The conference room's AV system was already set up for his presentation, including a large projector screen. As an IT consultant who had designed similar systems for numerous corporate clients, I understood exactly how it worked. The memory of how I'd once used such a system to expose David's betrayal floated to the surface of my mind, but I pushed it away. I had long ago chosen a different path, one of dignity and quiet strength rather than public revenge. Diane dear, Elizabeth called out, approaching again as I returned to my seat. Is everything all right? You look pale. I'm fine, I assured her, watching Amy return to her seat. Just catching up with William about some business matters. Elizabeth smiled, but her eyes narrowed slightly. Business matters? How interesting. William hasn't mentioned any collaborations. Before I could respond, the lights dimmed slightly, and David took his place at the podium. William stepped up to begin his introduction, speaking about family legacy and the importance of moral character in business. I sat beside Amy, watching my daughter's face as she observed the grandfather she barely knew praise the father who had been largely absent from her life. The Brown name has always stood for integrity, William was saying, his voice filled with pride that seemed at odds with what I knew about his son. And while we've faced challenges, our commitment to quality and family values remains unchanged. Amy leaned over to whisper in my ear. Is that why we only see them twice a year? Because of their commitment to family? I squeezed her hand gently, a silent request for patience. As David stepped forward to accept his award, I couldn't help remembering how differently I had once imagined our lives unfolding, before I discovered the truth about the man I had married. The past resurfaces, David cleared his throat, adjusting his tie as he accepted the Crystal Award from his father. His practiced smile, the same one that had once charmed me 20 years ago, spread across his face as he looked out at the assembled company employees and family members. Thank you, Father, for those kind words, he began, his voice carrying that authoritative tone he'd always used in public settings. It's an honor to accept this award as we celebrate 50 years of Brown Interior's excellence. I watched him carefully, this man who had once been the center of my world. At 54, David was still handsome, though his once dark hair was now streaked with silver and lines had formed around his eyes. He'd aged well externally, but I knew the shallow ambition that lay beneath that polished exterior. Our company was built on traditional values, David continued, making eye contact with various executives in the room. Dedication to quality, commitment to employees, and above all, integrity in everything we do. Amy shifted beside me, and I could sense her discomfort. Though I'd never spoken ill of her father, she was perceptive enough to recognize the disconnect between his words and his actions over the years. The missed birthdays, the cancelled visits, the hollow promises. As we move forward into the digital age, David was saying, Brown Interiors remains committed to those core values while embracing innovation. My mind drifted back to that morning 20 years ago. David had left his phone on our hotel room's desk while showering, and I normally wouldn't have looked, but the preview notification caught my eye. Missing you already. Last night was incredible from someone named Jessica M., executive assistant. With trembling hands and a tightening knot in my stomach, I'd opened his phone. His password was still our wedding date, something he'd apparently forgotten to change. What I found made my world collapse: hundreds of messages, photos, and plans to start a competing business using stolen Brown Interiors client information, all with Jessica Morris, his new assistant. That was also when I discovered I was pregnant with Amy. Now, watching him speak about integrity, I felt not the burning rage of betrayal that had consumed me 20 years ago, but a quiet sadness for the wasted years and the father Amy had never truly known. My attention was drawn back to the present when Jessica Morris slipped into the room through a side door, speaking quietly into her phone. Something about her furtive movements and the way she kept glancing at David sparked my professional instincts. After 20 years as an IT consultant, I'd developed a sharp eye for suspicious behavior, especially around corporate information. "Mom," Amy whispered, following my gaze. "Isn't that Dad's assistant? The one Aunt Sarah was telling me about?" I nodded slightly, wondering what Sarah might have shared with my daughter. "Yes, that's Jessica Morris." Amy's expression darkened. "Aunt Sarah said she's the reason Dad's hardly ever at family events anymore." She said. She stopped suddenly, looking uncomfortable. "It's okay," I assured her quietly. "You can tell me." Amy hesitated, then leaned closer. She said history repeats itself in the Brown family. That Dad hasn't changed since you two were together. The implication hung between us, and I saw the question in Amy's eyes, one I'd managed to avoid for 16 years by crafting a sanitized version of our divorce. I'd told her only that her father and I had grown apart, that sometimes people just weren't meant to stay together. I'd never mentioned the betrayal, the business scheme, or how William had offered me a way out with dignity. "There's a lot about that time that I've never shared with you," I admitted softly. "I wanted to protect you from things that might color your relationship with your father." "I'm not a child anymore, Mom," Amy replied, a hint of her teenage assertiveness surfacing. "I'm applying to colleges next year. Don't you think I deserve to know the truth about my own family?" Before I could respond, the hotel's sophisticated sound system crackled slightly, and Jessica's voice suddenly filled the room, cutting across David's speech. "Told you I'm handling it," her voice projected clearly through the speakers. She was apparently unaware that her phone call was being broadcast through the AV system, likely because she'd accidentally connected to the Bluetooth audio when she entered the room. "Yes, I've already copied the client list and pricing models. Once David finalizes the deal with the Chinese manufacturer, we can move forward with our own lineup." The room fell into shocked silence. David froze at the podium, his face draining of color as he stared at Jessica, who was still speaking, oblivious to the fact that everyone could hear her. "By the time Old Man Brown realizes what's happening, we'll have already approached their top 10 clients," she continued. "David's got them all wrapped around his finger with this family legacy nonsense." I felt a strange sense of déjà vu wash over me. 20 years later, and David was still the same man, making the same mistakes, betraying his family in the same way. My eyes met William's across the room, and I saw the pain and anger on his face as he realized his son was once again planning to undermine the family business. Jessica finally noticed the silence in the room and looked up, her eyes widening with horror as she realized what had happened. She quickly ended her call, but the damage was done. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on me. Technology had exposed David's betrayal once again, though this time it was pure coincidence rather than my deliberate action. "David," William's voice cut through the silence, cold and commanding. "My office. Now." As David stumbled away from the podium, his eyes met mine briefly. I saw recognition there. He knew I understood exactly what was happening because he'd done it before, to me. With a slight nod of acknowledgement, I remained seated, my hand covering Amy's as she processed what she'd just witnessed. "Mom," she whispered, her voice shaking slightly. Was this what happened with you and Dad too?" The moment of truth had arrived, not through my planning but through David's own repeated mistakes. Looking into my daughter's confused eyes, I knew it was time to finally share the complete story of our past. The truth revealed, the next morning, I sat in my hotel room with Amy, both of us nursing cups of coffee as sunlight filtered through the curtains. After the chaos of the previous evening, William had quickly ended the celebration, and hotel staff had efficiently ushered guests out while the Brown family retreated to deal with their latest crisis. I had taken Amy back to our room, knowing she had questions I could no longer avoid. "So that's why we left Detroit," Amy said quietly, piecing together the fragments of family history I'd finally shared with her. "Not just because of your job offer in Chicago." I nodded, watching her process 20 years of carefully filtered family history. "The job offer came after, because of my work helping protect Brown Interior Systems after I discovered what your father and his assistant were planning." Amy set her cup down, her hand slightly unsteady. At 16, she had her father's determined chin and my analytical mind, a combination that made her both perceptive and forthright. All these years, I thought Dad was just busy. Too busy for regular visits, too busy to come to my recitals. Her voice held the hurt of a child who had constructed elaborate excuses for an absent parent. But he was just self-centered, wasn't he? Like he is now with this Jessica person. I chose my words carefully, the habit of 2 decades. "Your father has always been ambitious. The company, his image in the industry, those have always come first for him." "But you never told me," Amy said, a hint of accusation in her tone. "You let me believe this fairy tale that you just grew apart. You let me make excuses for him. I wanted you to form your own relationship with your father, without my history coloring your perspective," I explained, reaching for her hand across the small table. "Maybe that was wrong, but I thought I was protecting you." Amy pulled her hand away, standing to pace the room. "Protecting me? By hiding the truth?" "Mom, I've spent years wondering what was wrong with me, why Dad never seemed to want to be part of my life. I thought it was something I did." Her words struck me like a physical blow. In my determination to take the high road, to never speak ill of David, I had inadvertently let my daughter believe she was somehow at fault for her father's absence. "Amy, no," I said, standing to face her. "Nothing was ever your fault. Your father's choices, both then and now, were about his own selfish desires, not about you or me." A knock at the door interrupted us. I opened it to find Carol Lee, my longtime friend and attorney, standing in the hallway. Her practical suit and no-nonsense expression were exactly what I needed in that moment. "I came as soon as I got your message," Carol said, stepping inside and giving Amy a warm hug. "Quite the dramatic evening, from what you told me." "Aunt Carol," Amy said, using the honorary title she'd given my friend years ago. "Did you know about all this too? About what Dad did to Mom?" Carol glanced at me, silently asking how much I'd shared. When I nodded, she turned back to Amy. "I did," she admitted. "I was your mother's attorney during the divorce. But like your mom, I believed it was her story to tell when the time was right." Amy crossed her arms, the gesture so reminiscent of how I'd stood my ground in difficult situations that I nearly smiled despite the tension. "Well, the time is now," she declared. "I want to know everything. No more protecting me." My phone rang, William Brown's name appeared on the screen. With a quick apology to Amy and Carol, I answered. "Diane," William's voice sounded tired but resolute. "The board is assembling in an hour. I'd still like you to attend, if you're willing." I glanced at Amy, who was watching me intently. William, I appreciate the invitation, but given what happened last night, because of what happened last night, he interrupted, we need your expertise more than ever. David has been temporarily relieved of his duties while we investigate. Jessica Morris has already been terminated. The parallels to 20 years ago were striking, though this time the exposure had been accidental rather than my deliberate action. I'll attend the meeting, I decided, but only if Amy can come with me. She deserves to understand her family legacy, all of it, not just the polished version David presents. After a brief hesitation, William agreed. As I ended the call, Amy looked at me with newfound respect. You're really going to help them? After everything? I smiled at my daughter, seeing in her face the strength and intelligence that would carry her far beyond the family drama she'd been born into. The company employs hundreds of people who had nothing to do with your father's actions, I explained. And whether we like it or not, Brown Interiors is part of your heritage. Carol nodded approvingly. Besides, there's nothing quite like proving your worth to people who once underestimated you. An hour later, we walked into Brown Interiors' elegant boardroom, where somber-faced executives sat around a massive table. Elizabeth Brown was there, looking uncharacteristically disheveled, her perfect composure finally cracked by her son's public disgrace. Sarah, David's sister, gave me a small smile of solidarity as we entered. William stood at the head of the table, his authority undiminished despite the family crisis. Thank you all for coming on such short notice. As you know, we face an unprecedented situation. His eyes met mine as I took a seat, Amy beside me. We also have an opportunity to address long-standing issues with our technological infrastructure and online presence. To that end, I've invited Diane Foster, a leading IT systems consultant, to join us today. Several board members exchanged glances, clearly recognizing my name and connection to the family. Some of you may remember Ms. Foster as David's former wife, William continued, his tone leaving no room for gossip. What you may not know is that she has built one of the Midwest's most respected IT consulting firms over the past 15 years, specializing in retail systems modernization. As William invited me to present my initial assessment of Brown Interiors' technology needs, I felt Amy's proud gaze on me. The conference room was the same one where I had once sat quietly as David's wife, my expertise dismissed. Now I stood at the podium, my experience and knowledge commanding the respect of the entire board. The path that had led me back to this room was not one I would have chosen, but standing there, sharing my vision for how Brown Interiors could modernize its operations for the digital age, I realized that the painful past had forged something valuable after all, not just my career, but the strength to face the Browns on my own terms, with my daughter bearing witness to her mother's hard-won expertise. Confrontation and resolution. After my presentation, the boardroom filled with questions about digital transformation, cloud-based inventory systems, and online customer experience. Professional inquiries that had nothing to do with my past with the Brown family. I answered each one with the confidence earned through years of successful projects, aware of Amy watching me with new understanding in her eyes. This implementation timeline seems aggressive, one executive commented, reviewing the proposal I'd outlined. Can it really be accomplished in 6 months? My team has completed similar projects for 3 major furniture retailers in the past 2 years, I replied, standing my ground with the assurance that came from decades of expertise. With proper resources and commitment, yes, it's entirely achievable. As the meeting drew to a close, William asked me to stay behind, along with Amy and the core family members on the board. Once the room had cleared of non-family executives, the atmosphere shifted from professional to personal. I believe we need to address the elephant in the room, Elizabeth said, her voice steadier than her slightly trembling hands. David has put this company in jeopardy, again. She looked directly at me for the first time. Diane, I owe you an apology. 20 years ago, I didn't believe what you told us about David's plans. I convinced myself you were exaggerating to get a better divorce settlement. The admission stunned me. For years, I'd assumed the entire Brown family had closed ranks around David, despite the evidence I'd provided to William. Mother didn't tell me either, Sarah added, giving me a sad smile. I only learned the full story a few years ago when I found the original investigation file in Father's office. William cleared his throat, looking every one of his 72 years. David is my son, and I love him. But this company was built on principles he clearly doesn't share. He turned to Amy, who sat straight-backed beside me. Your mother showed remarkable restraint and dignity 20 years ago. She could have publicly exposed your father's actions, but she chose a quieter path, partly, I believe, to protect your relationship with him. Amy's hand found mine under the table, a silent acknowledgement of what my silence had cost me over the years. David is currently with our legal team, William continued. Jessica Morris apparently left the hotel last night with company data. We're pursuing all available measures to contain the damage. Where does this leave us? I asked, focusing on the practical next steps rather than dwelling on old wounds. If you want my firm to implement the systems overhaul, we'll need full access and authority. William nodded decisively. I'm proposing to the board that we retain your company as our primary technology consultant, with you personally overseeing the digital transformation project. He paused, looking significantly at Elizabeth and Sarah before continuing. Additionally, I believe it's time for fresh perspectives on our board. I'd like to nominate you for a board position, Diane. Elizabeth gasped softly, while Sarah broke into a genuine smile. A board position? I echoed, momentarily caught off guard. This was far beyond the consulting arrangement I'd anticipated. You understand both our business and the technology landscape we need to navigate, William explained. More importantly, you've demonstrated integrity under difficult circumstances, exactly what Brown Interiors needs right now. Before I could respond, the boardroom door opened and David stormed in, his face flushed with anger. He stopped short when he saw all of us gathered there. A family meeting without me? He asked, his voice tightly controlled but with fury simmering beneath. His eyes landed on Amy, then narrowed as he noticed our joined hands. I see you've been sharing your version of history. There's only one version, David, William replied firmly. The same pattern we saw 20 years ago with Diane, we're seeing now with Jessica Morris. David's gaze shifted to me, a mixture of anger and something that might have been shame crossing his features. You must be enjoying this, he said bitterly. 20 years of waiting for your revenge. I felt Amy tense beside me, but I kept my voice calm. This isn't about revenge, David. It never was. I moved on with my life and built something I'm proud of. I've been invited here to help salvage what your actions have put at risk, again. David, Elizabeth interjected, her social polish cracking to reveal raw maternal disappointment. Jessica Morris has been caught trying to access our client database remotely. The IT team has already traced the attempt to her home computer. David's confident facade crumbled slightly. She was just helping me prepare for client meetings. At midnight, after being terminated? Sarah asked skeptically. The same Jessica who was overheard discussing taking Brown clients to a competing venture. Amy stood suddenly, drawing everyone's attention. I've spent my whole life making excuses for why you were never there, Dad. Mom never said a bad word about you, even when I'd cry because you missed another school event or canceled another visit. Her voice was steady, but I could see the emotion she was controlling. I thought I wasn't important enough. But that wasn't it, was it? You were just selfish. David looked genuinely shocked at his daughter's words, perhaps never having considered how his actions appeared through her eyes. Amy, that's not fair. I've always provided for you, money isn't parenting, she cut him off. Mom was there. Every day, every night, every game and recital and parent-teacher conference. She built her business while never missing what mattered to me. And I never knew until last night that you tried to hurt her the same way you're hurting the company now. The room fell silent as David absorbed his daughter's words. For perhaps the first time, I saw him truly affected by the consequences of his actions, not the legal or financial ramifications, but the human cost, written clearly on his daughter's face. William was the first to speak. David, the board will be voting tomorrow on your continued role with the company. Until then, you're suspended from all duties and access. Please surrender your company devices to security on your way out. David looked around the table, perhaps seeking an ally, but found none. With a final glare at me, he walked out, leaving behind the lingering question of whether this time, finally, he would face real consequences for his actions. Elizabeth sighed deeply once he'd gone. All these years, protecting the family image, and for what? She turned to Amy with tears in her eyes. I'm sorry we weren't the grandparents you deserved, dear. We were so busy preserving the appearance of the perfect family that we failed to see what really mattered. Amy's expression softened slightly. I'd like to know my grandparents better, she said carefully. The real ones, not just the twice-a-year formal visit versions. William smiled at his granddaughter with genuine warmth. We'd like that very much. He turned to me. Diane, regarding the board position, I need time to consider it, I said honestly. This is all happening very quickly, and my primary focus has always been Amy's well-being. Mom, Amy said, with the clear-eyed wisdom that sometimes made her seem older than her 16 years, I think you should do it. Not just for Brown Interiors, but for yourself. You've earned this. Looking around the table at the Browns, my former family, Amy's blood relatives, and now potentially my business associates, I realized that life had brought me full circle. Not for revenge, as David had suggested, but perhaps for resolution, both for myself and for my daughter. I'll consider the board position, I told William, on one condition. Amy's college fund needs to be independent of any Brown family politics or business decisions. Her future is non-negotiable. William nodded solemnly. I've already instructed our attorneys to establish a trust in her name, completely separate from company affairs or David's position. As we concluded the meeting, Sarah approached me, her expression serious. He's still my brother, and I still love him, she said quietly. But what you did for Amy all these years, never poisoning her against him despite what happened, that shows remarkable character, Diane. I glanced at Amy, who was accepting Elizabeth's tentative hug. I did what I thought was right for her. Maybe not always perfectly, but with the best intentions. Sometimes that's all any of us can do, Sarah replied, watching her niece with affection. And sometimes, it's enough. New beginnings. 6 months later, I sat in my new corner office at Brown Interiors headquarters, reviewing the quarterly results of our digital transformation project. The view of Detroit's skyline spread before me, so different from my Chicago office but becoming increasingly familiar as I split my time between the two cities. The changes we'd implemented were already showing impressive results: online sales up 32%, inventory management costs down 18%, and customer satisfaction scores climbing steadily. On my desk sat the latest issue of Furniture Today magazine with a feature article titled Brown Interiors Digital Renaissance: How a Family Company Reinvented Itself for the 21st Century. Amy's photograph sat prominently on my desk, her recent senior portrait, capturing her confidence as she prepared for college next fall. She'd been accepted to 3 top universities and was leaning toward Northwestern's computer science program, a choice that made me both proud and slightly nostalgic. My daughter was following in my professional footsteps while charting her own course. A knock at my door interrupted my thoughts. The board members are gathering for the quarterly meeting, Maria, my assistant, announced. And your 4 o'clock with the web development team is confirmed. Thank you, Maria, I replied, gathering my presentation materials. And has Carol confirmed for dinner tonight? Yes, she'll meet you and Amy at the restaurant at 7. Maria smiled. Also, Ms. Brown, Sarah, asked if you could spare a few minutes before the board meeting. I nodded, checking my watch. The past 6 months had transformed my relationship with the Brown family in ways I never could have anticipated. Sarah had become something of an ally, William a respected mentor, and even Elizabeth had softened considerably, especially in her relationship with Amy. As for David, the situation had resolved with less drama than expected. After the evidence of his planned corporate espionage became irrefutable, he had accepted a generous severance package in exchange for his shares and a non-compete agreement. Last I'd heard from Amy, who maintained limited contact with him, he had moved to Florida and was dating a real estate agent there. I made my way to the small conference room where Sarah waited, her elegant figure silhouetted against the window. At 48, she had stepped up to take a more active role in the company since David's departure, revealing a business acumen that had previously been overshadowed by her brother. "Diane," she greeted me warmly. "The numbers look fantastic. The board is positively giddy." "The team has done impressive work," I acknowledged. "Your design department's collaboration with the tech group has been particularly effective." Sarah nodded, but her expression suggested she had something more personal to discuss. "I wanted to catch you before the meeting because," she hesitated. "David called yesterday. He's heard about our success through industry channels, and about your role in it." I felt a flicker of tension but kept my expression neutral. "Did he have something specific to say?" "He wanted to know if you'd orchestrated his downfall," Sarah said with a sad smile. "If you'd been working behind the scenes all these years, planning your revenge." The irony nearly made me laugh. 20 years building my own business, raising our daughter, creating a life completely separate from the Browns, that would be quite the long game. "That's essentially what I told him," Sarah replied. "But he's always needed someone else to blame for his failures." She hesitated again. "He also asked about Amy's college decision." "He could ask her directly," I pointed out. "She has a phone." Sarah nodded. I suggested the same. "He said he'd try to call her this weekend." She studied me carefully. "It still amazes me, how you've managed to help Amy maintain some relationship with him, despite everything." I thought about the complex balance I'd tried to strike over the years, protecting Amy while allowing her to form her own opinions about her father. She deserves to make her own choices about her relationship with David. I've tried not to get in the way of that. "Well, it speaks volumes that she's chosen to spend her school breaks here with you, even when you're working," Sarah observed. "She's become quite popular with the design interns, by the way. Elizabeth is convinced she'll eventually join the company." "Amy will follow her own path," I said confidently. "But I appreciate how welcoming everyone has been to her." As we walked together toward the boardroom, I reflected on the unexpected turns my life had taken. When I'd attended the 50th anniversary celebration 6 months ago, I'd been determined to maintain the careful distance I'd established from the Brown family. Now I was helping lead their company into a new era, collaborating with people I'd once thought I'd never willingly speak to again. The boardroom was filled with familiar faces when we entered. William, still commanding respect at the head of the table despite having stepped back from day-to-day operations. Elizabeth, more relaxed than I'd ever seen her, now focusing her social skills on charitable foundations rather than maintaining appearances. The other board members, once David's allies or indifferent to me, now valued colleagues. As the meeting began and I presented the quarterly results, I could feel the satisfaction of having proven my worth not through revenge or manipulation, but through genuine expertise and hard work. The young bride whose contributions had been dismissed 20 years ago was now a respected leader helping to secure the company's future, and by extension, part of Amy's inheritance. After the meeting, I returned to my office to find Amy waiting, her laptop open on the small conference table where she sometimes studied when visiting me at work. "How was school?" I asked, noting the subtle highlights in her hair and new additions since the weekend. "Boring," she replied with the typical teenage dismissal. "But I aced my calculus test." She closed her laptop and regarded me curiously. "Grandma called. She wants us to come for dinner Sunday before we head back to Chicago. She mentioned something about Dad calling her too." I kept my expression neutral, letting Amy lead the conversation about her father as I always had. "Are you comfortable with that?" Amy considered the question seriously, another sign of the maturity that had blossomed in her over the past months. "I think so. It's weird, but since everything happened, it's actually been easier to talk to him. Like the pressure of pretending everything was perfect is gone." I nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. The exposure of David's deception had been painful but had ultimately brought a kind of clarity to all our relationships. "Mom," Amy said suddenly, "are you happy? With how everything turned out, I mean. With being back involved with the Browns after everything they put you through." The question caught me off guard with its directness. I sat down beside my daughter, considering my answer carefully. "I'm content with where I am," I told her honestly. 20 years ago, I was devastated by your father's betrayal, but that painful experience ultimately led me to build a successful business and raise an amazing daughter. I smiled at her. Coming back here wasn't about the Browns, really. It was about recognizing an opportunity to do work I'm good at, and perhaps to close some old chapters in a way that feels right. Amy nodded, seeming satisfied with my answer. Well, for what it's worth, I think Grandpa William was right. The company needed you. And maybe you needed this too, to come back on your own terms. As we gathered our things to leave for dinner with Carol, I glanced around my office, a tangible symbol of how life could come full circle in unexpected ways. The betrayal that had once shattered my world had ultimately led me to greater strength, independence, and now, a resolution I could never have foreseen. Ready to go? Amy asked, slinging her backpack over her shoulder. I nodded, turning off my desk lamp. Ready. 20 years ago, I had walked away from Brown Interiors with a broken heart and an uncertain future. Now I walked out with my daughter beside me, secure in the knowledge that we had both found our places in this complicated family landscape, not through revenge or bitterness, but through resilience, integrity, and the courage to embrace unexpected new beginnings.
You're still the failure I kicked out of my house all those years ago. No grant or award is going to change that. My father's words hung in the frigid night air of the hotel parking lot, each syllable as sharp and cutting as they had been 15 years ago when he first cast me out. The floodlights cast harsh shadows across his face, highlighting the disgust written there. Disgust at discovering that his company's $2 million grant had just been awarded to the daughter he had disowned. I stood there in my evening gown, the applause from the ceremony still echoing in my ears, yet feeling as small as I had at 19. But something was different now. The trembling I felt wasn't fear. It was rage, building like a chemical reaction I couldn't control. I didn't ask for this, I said, my voice steadier than I expected. I never asked for your money or your approval. I earned this on my own, just like everything else. As the words left my mouth, I realized how long I'd waited to say them. 15 years of struggling, studying, and building a life from nothing, all to prove something to a man who would never see it. But tonight would change everything. Tonight, I would finally set myself free. Flashback, the beginning. My name is Rachel Palmer. I'm 37 now, a professor at Cambridge University and a respected researcher in environmental chemistry. But that night, the night of the gala, I was suddenly 19 again, clutching my community college acceptance letter while my father paced our marble-floored living room. This family has standards, he had thundered, his face flushed with anger. I remember how the chandelier light caught in his silver cufflinks as he gestured wildly. And you've done nothing but drag us down. You want to waste your life? Fine, but you'll do it on your own. I sometimes wonder if he knew what those words would cost us both. My father had grown up poor in rural Minnesota, the son of farm laborers who worked themselves to exhaustion. He built Mosaic fertilizers from nothing, climbing America's social ladder with relentless determination. To him, success wasn't just achievement, it was protection against ever returning to the poverty he'd escaped. My failure to get into a prestigious university wasn't just disappointment. It was betrayal of everything he'd built. My mother stood by, scrolling through her phone as if I didn't exist. Victoria Palmer, born to wealth and groomed to be the perfect corporate wife, had learned long ago that disagreeing with my father came at too high a price. Once, when I was 14, I'd overheard her crying in their bedroom after defending me during one of his tirades about my grades. She never did it again. I remember the weight of that duffel bag as I left that night. It wasn't just filled with hastily packed clothes, it held the reality of being completely on my own. My parents didn't even come to the door to say goodbye. I felt invisible, discarded, like I'd never been a part of their world to begin with. Flashback, finding my way. For the first few weeks, I stayed with a friend, sleeping on her pull-out couch while I tried to figure out my next steps. Some nights, I'd wake up in panic, the crushing weight of depression making it hard to breathe. My parents had always dismissed my mental health struggles. What could you possibly be sad about? My mother had once said, her voice dripping with irritation. Community college wasn't glamorous, but it felt like the only thing I could control. I worked part-time at a diner to cover tuition and rent. The breakfast shift started at 5 a.m., leaving my hands smelling of bacon and coffee when I stumbled into chemistry class. When I finally scraped together enough to move into a tiny studio apartment, it was a grind, balancing classes, work, and the overwhelming sense of failure that clung to me like a second skin. But something about being on my own, away from their constant judgment, gave me a flicker of hope. For the first time, I could breathe, even if the air felt thin. I still remember my first chemistry exam. I'd spent weeks preparing, going over every formula, every reaction, until I could practically recite them in my sleep. When the professor handed back the graded test, I was terrified to look. But there it was, a 92%. I nearly cried right there in the middle of the classroom. My first instinct was to call home, to prove to my father that I wasn't the failure he thought I was. My finger hovered over his number, but I couldn't press dial. What was I expecting? Congratulations? Pride? I put the phone away. This grade wasn't for him. It was for me. It wasn't perfect, but it was mine. I'd earned it. It felt like the first small step toward rebuilding myself after everything had fallen apart. Flashback. The only family I had, the only family member who bothered to show up at my bachelor's degree graduation ceremony was Aunt Lydia. She was my mother's younger sister, the black sheep of the family. Lydia had defied family expectations to pursue art in Paris during her 20s, a decision that led to her being effectively excommunicated from proper Palmer Society events. "You did it, kid," she said, pulling me into a tight hug in the parking lot after the ceremony. "I'm so proud of you." A huge bouquet of wildflowers was clutched in her hands, not the perfectly arranged roses my mother would have chosen, but vibrant, untamed blooms that seemed to celebrate breaking free. I felt a lump form in my throat. "They didn't even call," I said, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. "Not once." Even after I graduated with honors. Lydia's eyes softened. "Your father won't admit it, but you remind him too much of himself, the determination, the brilliance. Except you're using it differently than he would, and that terrifies him." She brushed a tear from my cheek. "And your mother. Victoria spent so long suppressing her own dreams that watching you pursue yours is painful for her." "That doesn't excuse them," I said. "No, it doesn't." She squeezed my shoulders. "But understanding doesn't require forgiveness, Rachel. It just helps you move forward without their weight dragging you down." Lydia was the one who reminded me that family didn't have to mean perfection, that love could come from unexpected places. She didn't care that I hadn't followed the straight path my parents wanted for me. She cared that I had made it on my own, no matter the hurdles. Flashback, Oxford calling. A few months after graduation, I was wrapping up a research project at the university when Dr. Collins pulled me aside. He was an old school chemist with perpetually ink-stained fingers and a passion for the periodic table like it was a work of art. "Rachel," he said, his voice low and thoughtful, "I've been in touch with some colleagues at Oxford University. They're offering a research opportunity in environmental chemistry, and I think you'd be a perfect fit." At first, I thought it was a joke. Oxford? One of the most prestigious universities in the world? Me? But Dr. Collins insisted. He told me that this wasn't just a job. It was a chance to make real contributions to the field, and that I deserved the opportunity. "Don't let fear hold you back, Rachel," he said, peering at me over his reading glasses. "You've proven yourself. Now it's time to take that next step." Dr. Collins' belief in me was something I had craved from my father my entire life, not blind faith, but recognition based on merit, on seeing my potential even when I couldn't. I applied, hesitantly at first, not fully believing it could happen. When the acceptance email arrived weeks later, I sat staring at my laptop screen in disbelief for nearly an hour. I called Lydia immediately. "I'm proud of you, but not surprised," she said, her voice warm through the phone. "Do this for yourself, Rachel. You've worked too hard to let anything hold you back." I packed up my life in a single suitcase, asked Lydia not to tell anyone where I'd gone, and boarded a plane to England with nothing but a backpack and the faint hope that this could be my chance to finally become the person I always dreamed of being. Flashback. Building a new life. I settled into a small flat in Oxford with slanted ceilings and a temperamental heater. The first few weeks were tough. The academic culture, the isolation, the nagging feeling that I was an imposter who would soon be discovered. But the more I immersed myself in research, the more I felt at home. I was working on projects that mattered, things that could make a real impact on the world. As the years passed, I completed my master's, then, driven by momentum, applied for a PhD. The process was grueling, but I was determined. After years of sleepless nights and endless lab experiments, I earned my doctorate and became a respected researcher in environmental chemistry. Then came an offer that seemed almost too surreal to grasp, a professorship at Cambridge University. Standing in front of my first class, I remembered the shy girl who once could barely speak up in high school, who was told she wasn't good enough. Now I was shaping young minds, passing on knowledge and passion to the next generation. But even as I built this new life, there was still a piece of me that was always looking over my shoulder, wondering if anyone back home knew where I was, if anyone cared enough to find out. I hadn't heard from my parents since I left. No calls, no letters, no attempts to reach out. Sometimes I dream of my father reading about my research in a scientific journal, or my mother seeing my name on a university website. Did they ever think about me? Did they regret what happened? Or was I truly erased from their world? The gala, unexpected reunion. The professional gala last week was supposed to be the culmination of everything I'd worked for, a celebration of my contributions to research and education. It was a night I'd been anticipating for months, a validation of the path I'd chosen. But fate had other plans. As I stepped into the restroom to catch my breath between conversations with colleagues, I came face to face with someone I hadn't seen in nearly 15 years. My mother. She was at the sink reapplying her lipstick, looking every bit the part of the wealthy socialite she'd always been. Her hair was perfectly styled, her emerald evening gown clearly designer, her movements practiced and precise. For a moment, I thought maybe she wouldn't recognize me, but then her eyes flicked up to the mirror and landed on my reflection. Her hand froze mid-motion, and I saw her jaw tighten. "Rachel," she said, her voice cool and detached, like we just bumped into each other at a country club instead of a bathroom after 15 years of silence. "I didn't expect to see you here." I steadied myself, gripping the edge of my clutch, feeling my heart race like I was 19 again. "I could say the same," I replied, keeping my tone even. "What brings you here?" She turned to face me, her posture as rigid as ever. "Your father and I were invited, of course. We've always been involved with organizations that support education." The underlying message was clear. We belong here. "Do you? And you?" she asked, as if my presence required explanation. "I'm being honored tonight," I said, meeting her gaze, "for my work and research." Her expression barely shifted, but I caught the faintest flicker of surprise in her eyes before she masked it. "I see," she said, turning back to the mirror. "Well, I suppose everyone finds their way eventually." It wasn't quite dismissal, but it wasn't acknowledgement either. Just a vague platitude that managed to minimize everything I'd accomplished. As she left the bathroom, I watched her glide out of the door, back to the people she was comfortable with. I stood there, feeling the familiar weight of her judgment settle over me. All these years, all this distance, all my accomplishments, and I still felt like that uncertain girl desperate for approval. The gala. Revelation and betrayal. The ceremony began shortly after my mother disappeared into the crowd. I took a deep breath, trying to shake off the weight of that encounter. It was time to take my place, to step into the role I had fought so hard to claim. As I made my way to the front, they called my name, Rachel Palmer, honored for her groundbreaking contributions to education and sustainable chemistry. The applause was deafening, but it felt strangely hollow. I took the stage, trying to maintain a calm exterior, but inside all I could think about was whether my parents were watching, what they were thinking. The spotlight hit me, and I could feel my heart racing. This wasn't just a recognition of my work. This was my way of showing the world that I was more than the person my parents had tried to make me believe I was. Then came the announcement that changed everything. "Ladies and gentlemen," the host's voice rang out. "We have an exciting announcement. A generous donor has pledged a grant of $2 million to the recipient of this award. This extraordinary contribution is intended to support the continued efforts of the recipient's research and further their impact on the world of education." The room went quiet, and I felt every pair of eyes shift toward me. $2 million. The number hung in the air, surreal and overwhelming. This grant has been made possible through the contributions of Mosaic Fertilizers, a company led by one of the most influential figures in the fertilizer industry. Mosaic Fertilizers. My father's company. I froze. The donor, the one whose generosity had made this award possible, was my father's company. My chest tightened as the truth hit me. The man who had spent years treating me like an embarrassment, the one who had rejected my path, had unknowingly backed the very award that would be the crowning achievement of my career. Through the sea of faces, I saw him, my father, standing up abruptly near the back of the room, his face twisted in disgust. Our eyes met for a brief moment before he turned sharply and began making his way toward the door. His movements were swift and deliberate, as if he couldn't get out of that room fast enough. The irony was almost too much to bear. In that moment, I stood there stunned as the announcer's words continued to echo. The applause around me felt distant, like I was hearing it underwater. "Thank you," I managed to say into the microphone, my voice shaky but steady enough. Then, without another word, I walked off the stage and headed for the back door. I had to find him. This couldn't end like this, not when everything had come full circle. The confrontation, full circle. I pushed through the door leading outside, scanning the dimly lit parking lot. There he was, standing by his car, his back to me. Even from behind, I could see the tension in his shoulders, the rigid posture I'd grown up fearing. "Dad," I called out, my voice almost cracking. He didn't look back at first, his shoulders stiffening even more, but when he finally turned around, I saw the bitter expression on his face. "What is it now, Rachel?" he asked sharply, his voice colder than I'd ever heard it. "You think I'm going to congratulate you?" I stopped just a few feet away, my heart hammering. "I didn't ask for this," I said, keeping my voice steady despite the rush of emotions. "I never asked for your money or your approval. I earned this on my own, just like everything else." He sneered, his lips curling into a bitter smile. "I don't know whether to be disgusted or impressed, but here you are, taking my money. I'm sure that's exactly what you wanted, right? To make a fool of me? Is that what you think this is about?" I asked, a lifetime of hurt bubbling to the surface. "That after 15 years of silence, after you threw me out like I was nothing, I orchestrated all this to embarrass you? Don't be dramatic," he said dismissively. "You were given every advantage except your love." The words burst out before I could stop them, echoing in the empty parking lot. "Do you have any idea what it's like to never be good enough? To be told you're a disappointment just for struggling? To be abandoned by the people who were supposed to protect you?" Something flashed in his eyes, not softening, but recognition, perhaps. For the briefest moment, I saw the farm boy from Minnesota who had also never been good enough. "You're still the failure I kicked out of my house all those years ago," he said finally, his voice slightly less sure. "No grant or award is going to change that." I felt a strange calm wash over me then, a clarity I'd been searching for my entire life. "You're right," I said quietly. "Nothing will change how you see me. And that's your loss, not mine." I turned away, but not before adding, "You know what the difference is between us, Dad? When people failed your expectations, you discarded them. When I see someone struggling, I remember what it was like to be thrown away, and I try to be the person I needed when I was 19. He didn't respond, and I didn't wait to see if he would. For the first time, I was walking away from him. Epilogue. Liberation. That night in my hotel room, I stared at the ceiling, replaying the confrontation with my father. At first, the $2 million grant had felt like a vindication, a cosmic joke at his expense. But as morning came, that feeling faded. The money, tied to his company, was never going to erase the years of pain and rejection. It wasn't going to heal the part of me that he had broken when he kicked me out of the house all those years ago. I opened my laptop and logged into the foundation's portal. With a few clicks, I directed the entire sum, every last cent of the $2 million, toward funding scholarships for underprivileged students, particularly those struggling with mental health issues. Students who had been overlooked, underestimated, and written off. I wanted to give them the chance to build something for themselves without being crushed under the weight of expectations that didn't belong to them. As I pressed the donation button, a sense of peace washed over me. The money that had once been tied to rejection and bitterness was now part of something greater, something that would outlast the sting of my father's judgment. And in that moment, I realized that I didn't need his money, his approval, or his recognition. I had built my own legacy, one that would live on through the students whose lives would be changed. I thought about calling Aunt Lydia to tell her what I'd done, but decided it could wait until morning. Instead, I walked to the window of my hotel room and looked out at the city lights. For the first time in my life, I felt truly free, not because I'd proven my father wrong, but because it no longer mattered if I had. The girl who left home with nothing but a duffel bag and a broken heart had become a woman who could stand on her own, who could turn pain into purpose. And that, more than any award or grant, was the real triumph. I was finally home in myself.